basically talking about feminist empiricism and feminist standpoint theory, kind of looking back retrospectively about how these have emerged over the last generation or so. And so anyway, hopefully that's useful. We're thinking generally for us, Longino is representing feminist empiricism. We had Collins and Hartsock, and then more recently Harding on the standpoint theory side. It's not a numbers game. It doesn't matter that there's 3-1 or anything like that. But she wants to say, Intemann that is, that generally speaking, by and large, nowadays, there's not as big a difference between these perspectives as there once was, although there still are differences, and that's what you really want to pay attention to, I think, in her discussion. Now that discussion does touch on a question that we had in a discussion, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago or so, just about the point, or what the value would be in increasing the representation of women in certain scientific fields where they are currently underrepresented. Just what exactly the point or the rationale for that would be. So have that in mind, and maybe we can even go back to that discussion topic. But do think about, for example, or pay attention to her example. She has a kind of extended example about a biomedical researcher. So it's a good example to think about just what the value of greater representation is supposed to be. That's just an interesting point where some difference is still definitely noticeable between the two perspectives, empiricism and standpoint theory. What I wanted to do just here was maybe just say a couple of things. Just actually relating it back to Scott and Oksala. Do you remember all that now? Remember Joan Scott and Johanna Oksala? I think it was week 8. You remember that. So basically Scott was the one kind of questioning lived experience and thinking that really we need to be more explaining that rather than using it to explain anything. Oksala, for her part, did not totally disagree with that, but still thought there was a very important place for experience in how we're going about things. I think this relates fairly well to empiricism, feminist empiricism, and feminist standpoint theory. Right? The point would be that feminist empiricism is still aiming for something along the lines of what Scott especially was critical of, but Oksala as well, and that is this kind of foundational role for experience. And as if in feminist empiricism the idea is that experience, lived experience, should be playing that role. There have been various kinds of biases within science that have gotten in the way of this, and that we do need to kind of introduce contextual values from outside of science, because basically science was never neutral anyways. So we can do a better job, get the right kinds of values guiding our inquiry so that, lived experience can play that kind of foundational role properly. Now that's just going to have some problems from others' perspectives, and I think Oksala agrees with this, and basically our standpoint theorists would as well. That there's still something a little too naive about that, or there's a problem there. There isn't really a problem when we're thinking about, say, reports, of experience of oppression or other negative aspects of sexist bias and so on. That's usually pretty important. We're not trying to get rid of that, of course. But there certainly are other cases where lived experience of individual women, say, does not, sort of go in the direction where we might expect it to, where they might actually have experienced somebody, say, in a very abusive relationship, or at least what everybody else thinks is a very abusive relationship, but their experience doesn't reflect that for some reason, and we might be suspicious of that. And that's, examples like that are what remind us that there can be problems when we're taking lived experience at face value. So a few things just to keep in mind always here, especially with standpoint theory. That's where Intemann goes. She thinks that generally the spirit, even of feminist empiricism, really, if you take it seriously, should be taken up in that direction where it really matters, right? That our approach to questions of knowledge and objectivity and science and so on are indeed based in lived experience, but in the right way, right? So it's important to remember that a standpoint is never simply the reflection of this or that perspective, right? It's a kind of a theoretical articulation, right, based on or kind of informed by that, but it can never simply reflect it. And that's especially because there is a diversity of different perspectives, right? So we can take different, sources of experience into account, and indeed we need to do that. That's partly the point of standpoint theory. So I want to relate it to Oksana just one more time in the sense where she talked about problematizing things, or she had a word like that, right? Problematization, where we really just make things more kind of complicated. We mess things up, at least initially, right? She was basically saying, she said it quite explicitly, I think, that we're interested in experience not because experience just directly tells us something about reality. So that's the way it doesn't play a foundational role. But we're interested in experience primarily because there are different experiences, right? And there are different experiences, different biased perspectives, and we need to kind of play them off against each other, and in and through doing so, come up with a new kind of theoretical perspective, which will be better, which will be able to deal with the various forms of bias that do exist. That's the thing the standpoint theory is most interested in, and that's what Harding makes a big deal about, right? To say that we really want to, overcome as best we possibly can the problematic biases that are out there. And we can do that basically through this approach to developing, right, kind of working out a new kind of theoretical view based on standpoint thinking. So this is the way we can think about the idea of epistemic advantage, because it might actually be better, in some ways it is, I think, to think that what we should say is more that traditional views are epistemically disadvantaged exactly because they don't do this, right? Because they don't scrutinize and think critically about their biases, or really almost any biases at all of a social systemic kind. And because they don't do that, that's the weakness, that's the problem, that's why they come up short. Whereas what we need to do from a feminist perspective is, right, try to gain as much awareness as we can of the forms of bias with which we are concerned in order to be able to go beyond them in a kind of productive new way. And that relates, among other things, to the point, Harding makes this point, a big one, I think, that when we're thinking about, kind of revamping science or doing it in a better way, it's not just about the same old questions, or even questions that even look like the same old questions. But when we do this and we go back, especially to marginalized standpoints, and kind of see from those angles what the biases are, it could be that we just come up with entirely new questions. Those might be some of the questions that science really ought to be dealing with, basically, if, right, we're really concerned with a better, kind of generally more accurate and comprehensive take on social reality. So the other piece then from Lorraine Code, it's a little long, I guess. It reads, I think, fairly well, but yeah, it's a little long and frankly a bit repetitive sometimes. I don't know if it's just me, but anyways, I think it's nice in the sense it brings a bunch of things together. It's kind of an overview, and that's all good. The one thing I just want to draw attention to, as I think it will in the discussion for this week as well, she repeatedly, on numerous occasions throughout, she invokes a term, acknowledgement, right? Thinking that questions of knowledge kind of fundamentally rest on issues of acknowledgement, right? So where we acknowledge each other, and we do so, or we should, properly and fairly and inclusively and so on. And that's kind of the key thing. And I think that's just a very nice point, which I wish she said more about. The point derives from a philosopher named Wittgenstein. It doesn't really matter for our purposes. But I think it relates well to some of the things we had at the very beginning in terms of silencing. It relates to issues of epistemic injustice, which kind of came out there in certain forms of those silencing, although all forms of silencing are a kind of epistemic injustice. But in a certain way, the idea of acknowledging each other, acknowledging people's experiences, acknowledging people's claims, and doing that in a fully responsible way, is a good way, I think, of tying a bunch of ideas together. It may or may not be ideal. That perhaps will come out in terms of discussion, but I think that's sort of the most useful, I think, the most valuable point that she kind of makes. She says lots of things throughout, and it's all very nice, so have a look. She makes some of her own suggestions toward the end, but we're not probably going to spend a ton of time on that. But do note as you go through that, or just make a note or highlight, or you can search. It's text searchable, so you can search for every time she uses acknowledge or acknowledgement. And just try to think about that and just what that might mean and whether or not that does sort of capture a lot of what we've been talking about in terms of these questions of knowledge, and what difference it would be or what really needs to change in order to take that in a real feminist direction. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up for now, and see you again soon.